5 key takeaways from Donald Trump's meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. Introduction. A meeting the world was watching. On August 18, 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump hosted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House in a meeting that had been described as decisive for the future of the war in Ukraine and, more broadly, for global security. This was not just another routine diplomatic encounter. It followed Trump's highly publicized meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska, a summit that raised both expectations and concerns. For the global public, the stakes went far beyond handshakes and photo ops. This meeting was about whether a pathway to peace could finally emerge in a war that has dragged on for over 3 years, killing tens of thousands, displacing millions, and reshaping Europe's political and security order. Analysts point to 5 key takeaways that explain what actually happened in Washington and why this moment could either mark a turning point or simply another pause in a long, grinding conflict. Key 1. Context and the narrative of the indispensable mediator. The meeting took place under an atmosphere of high anticipation. Trump had just returned from Alaska, where his discussions with Putin, while producing no formal agreements, allowed him to project the image of a statesman capable of opening doors that others in the West had failed to unlock. Hosting Zelensky was therefore the logical next step, reinforcing Trump's self-image as the indispensable mediator, the one leader who could talk to both sides. Yet the political context was complicated. In the U.S., members of Trump's own Republican Party, including Vice President J.D. Vance, had been vocal about what they saw as endless spending on Ukraine. The narrative of no blank checks was gaining traction with parts of the conservative base. Meanwhile, in Europe, France, Germany, and the Baltic states were urging Washington to keep supporting Kyiv strongly and warning against a premature peace deal that might legitimize Russia's territorial gains. Against this backdrop, Trump aimed to project global leadership, but also to signal to his domestic audience that any future aid to Ukraine must be tied to results. Key 2. The content of the meeting, security, negotiations, and territory. At the heart of the discussions were 3 central issues. 1. Security guarantees for Ukraine. Zelensky made it clear that without robust security guarantees, any peace agreement would be meaningless. With NATO membership off the table, something Trump flatly opposed, the talks turned to alternatives: bilateral defense agreements with the U.S., coalitions of willing allies, and ambitious European rearmament projects financed by the EU. 2. The possibility of a direct summit with Putin. Trump suggested that Putin was open to meeting with Zelensky in the near future, perhaps even in a tripartite format with Trump himself acting as guarantor. Moscow, however, gave no confirmation, underscoring how fragile these ideas are. For Zelensky, a face-to-face with Putin could be a powerful symbol, but he avoided committing publicly while leaving the door ajar for future talks. 3. The sensitive issue of territory. This was the most delicate point. Trump implied that recognizing the reality on the ground, in other words, accepting Russia's de facto control over parts of occupied Ukraine, might form part of a peace formula. For Zelensky, such a concession would be politically toxic, widely viewed inside Ukraine as betrayal. Still, the mere fact that territorial trade-offs were raised at all signals that some diplomatic circles are exploring this option, however controversial. Key 3. Zelensky's new tone, the diplomacy of gratitude. One of the most striking elements of the meeting was Zelensky's dramatic change in tone. In past interactions with U.S. officials, he had been criticized for appearing too demanding in his requests for weapons and funding, sparking tensions with Republican leaders skeptical of continued aid. This time, Zelensky leaned heavily into what some called the diplomacy of gratitude. Within the first minute of the meeting, he thanked Trump no fewer than 9 times. He praised Trump's leadership, emphasized his role as a potential peacemaker, and even mentioned First Lady Melania Trump's humanitarian efforts. The performance was intentional. Zelensky wanted to disarm critics in Washington and secure goodwill with Trump, fully aware that Ukraine's survival hinges on U.S. support. It was a carefully crafted strategy, not simply asking for aid, but flattering Trump personally and politically. The risk, of course, is that public gratitude can create expectations of future concessions, and Zelensky may one day be pressured to deliver more than he is willing to give. Key 4. Red lines and shattered taboos. The meeting also clarified the non-negotiables on both sides. Trump repeated firmly that Ukraine will not join NATO under his presidency. In his view, Ukraine must act as a buffer state between Russia and Europe, protected, yes, but not fully integrated into Western military structures. This position broke what had once been a taboo, publicly declaring NATO membership for Ukraine off the table. That forces Kyiv and its allies to explore alternative security models, from bilateral U.S. defense treaties to European mini-NATO agreements or a Marshall-style plan for military support. The other taboo was the issue of territorial concessions. While Zelensky insists that Ukraine's territorial integrity is non-negotiable, even the subtle suggestion of land swaps stirred unease across Europe. Many fear that rewarding invasion with territorial recognition would set a dangerous precedent worldwide. Here lies the core dilemma. Pursue a quick peace that might be fragile and unjust, or insist on a just and lasting peace, even if it takes more time and blood. Key 5. What comes next? Europe, guarantees, and the margin for error. What, if anything, changes after this meeting? In the short term, 3 fronts matter. 1. The prospect of a Zelensky-Putin summit. Washington floated the idea, but without Moscow's confirmation, it remains speculative. Any misstep or leak could derail the fragile trust needed to make it happen. 2. Security guarantees. If NATO is off the table, what credible protection can Ukraine receive? Some suggest a binding bilateral defense pact with the U.S. Others push for a pan-European framework under Franco-German leadership. Yet all agree, words mean little without hard power, weapons, training, and consistent funding. 3. Political narratives. Trump wants quick results he can present as proof of his peacemaking abilities. Zelensky must avoid appearing weak or desperate. The tension between these two imperatives could decide the fate of any negotiation. Adding complexity, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has offered Budapest as a neutral venue for talks. But Orbán's closeness with Moscow makes other European capitals wary. The margin for error is razor-thin. A leak suggesting territorial concessions could spark protests in Kyiv. An offhand Trump remark might fuel accusations that the U.S. is selling out Ukraine. And any delay in military aid could weaken Ukraine's battlefield position, eroding its leverage at the table. Conclusion: a step forward, but far from enough. In the end, Trump and Zelensky's meeting was less about breakthrough agreements and more about resetting communication. The atmosphere was cordial, the gratitude was carefully staged, and new pathways were hinted at, but no binding documents were signed, and no timelines for peace were established. The fundamental problems remain unsolved. Ukraine needs credible security guarantees. Russia seeks recognition of its territorial gains. The U.S. wants quick results, and Europe worries about dangerous precedents. The meeting reshaped the diplomatic theater in some ways. Zelensky learned that gratitude can be a political weapon. Trump bolstered his image as a global dealmaker. Europe was reminded that it cannot rely solely on Washington's terms. But the war is far from over. Unless there is a concrete package, ceasefire terms, withdrawal schedules, verifiable guarantees, and reconstruction funds, peace will remain more of a narrative than a reality. For now, the August 18th summit offers a more orderly picture than previous months, but still without the contract that turns diplomacy into lasting change. The world will be watching what comes next, knowing that the difference between a fragile truce and a real settlement could define not only Ukraine's fate, but the credibility of the West in the 21st century.